Barnaby Jones will return next Thursday night at 10, 9 Central and Mountain on most of these stations.
Word Balloon is brought to you by the League of Word Balloon Listeners. Welcome back, everybody. Time again for Word Balloon, the conversation show. John Suntress with you. I am thrilled to have both of my guests. You might see a dog right now. That is Miss Moneypenny, as I've been told. That's great. And a longtime friend, and I'm glad he's doing great. The former executive editor and co-publisher of DC Comics. Always great stories and a good hangout. Dan DiDio, everybody. Welcome back, Dan.
Hey, John. Good to see you, man. Thanks for the invite. It's kind of fun to see you again, even under these circumstances.
Well, they're good circumstances, man.
That's all right. Except I'm still waiting for that episode of Barnaby Jones. I can't wait to see what happens.
I think Lee Merriweather's in a lot of trouble in that episode.
Oh, my gosh.
I don't know if, I don't know how much you watch Pluto or Tubi, the free streamers, but there's an episode of Diagnosis Murder from the 90s where Mike Connors guest starred as Joe Mannix.
Oh, really?
It was totally a two-hander, and it became a 90s Mannix episode. And you see, I know who I'm talking to. They used footage from a 70s episode, and it was an unsolved case of Mannix that in the 90s he's going to finally solve. And Pernell Roberts and Beverly Garland, they had footage of them in the 70s in the 70s episode, and they were in the 90s part of the show as well, which was so anyone who likes old TV detective stuff, you will die. And man, Mike Connors at 70 whatever, he still had it, man. He was great.
That's awesome, man. That's great. That's great. Yeah, no, listen, my background was mostly TV before, it was all TV before joining DC. So I was a big fan of all that stuff. I actually started at started at CBS in 1981 as a page there, and was there for the real golden age, a lot of golden age stuff there with it was at CBS, it was the end. I was there for the end of MASH. And during all that crazy days and all that, when they were really at the top of the game. And then I moved over to ABC when they were really starting to lift up with things like 30-something and Wonder Years and Twin Peaks. So, got a chance to watch a real transformation in the TV business there, really, really growing up along the way. But it was a blast. And when you talk about shows like that, I'm a big sucker for that. I'm stuck on 60s TV right now, believe it or not. I'm back into Man from U.N.C.L.E., Voice to the Bottom of the Sea, things like that. I sort of, recapturing some of my youth. As you get a little bit older, you start to cocoon and go back to your early roots, and that's sort of what I'm doing right now.
Dan, I'm doing the same thing, and my fixation of 60 shows. Although I have watched a few, It Takes a Thief, because you got, and I'm fascinated by that fourth season where Fred Astaire plays Robert Wagner's dad, who's also
yeah.
And you see Fred Astaire in like fist fights and stuff, typical 60s action, and it's Fred Astaire. It's like, this is fantastic. So awesome. I get it, man. Yeah, I get it. And also, again, I love what you're doing at Mad Cave right now, Defenders of the Universe. Yeah, man. Another great 80s cartoon from back in the day.
Yeah, it is. Listen, it was fun. Again, I was always a fan of animation. And for me, when I was working at ABC in the 80s, I was really trying to get into children's television. That was what I really wanted to do. And ultimately, I make it there. I joined ABC Children's Programming in 1984. So it was a really fascinating period of time because at that time, children's television was getting squeezed really hard. And they were taking our time away from us. It used to be 5 hours on a Saturday. They got it down by the time we were there, they were getting it down to about 3 hours. And everything had to be semi-educational at that point too, to justify having a kid show on the air. So it was fascinating to me to try to find educational twists action shows and adventure shows. But I had a chance to work on, when I first got there, I got a chance to work on Tales from the Crypt Keeper, which was really a lot of fun. I worked with, and then I worked on an animated version of Free Willy, which was really weird, but a lot of fun. We had to make that educational, and I'm like, the whale talks. How educational can this be?
Was there any Jabberjaws crossover with Free Willy or anything?
I wish I could have done that. Listen, when I was one of the, when you get a chance to meet people you really wanted to meet, and working in animation, I got a chance to meet some real, just incredible people, folks. I met Lou Scheimer, met him for a little while. He was in charge of Filmation.
Yes.
Bill Hanna. Met Bill Hanna, Joe Ruby, had lunch with Joe Ruby one time, met with Fred Silverman, who told me the story on how Scooby-Doo was created. So,
wow.
It's just, it's stuff like that, it sticks with you, for your life, It was funny to do that in cartoons, and then to be able to graduate into comics and do that with some of the people that I grew up loving in comics, getting a chance to sit down and get an editorial lesson from Julie Schwartz, and sit down and speak to Murphy Anderson, who is my idol. That was like my god at the time, and to sit down with Murphy Anderson and folks like that, and Dick Giordano and Denny O'Neil and all these crazy people that you grew up with, that you wanted to just pick their brains, and have some fun with,
I do know, Dan, and obviously you had many more opportunities. But getting to know Denny in his final years was a real pleasure. Marty Pasco really became a good friend. In fact, I dragged him to a couple cons in Cincinnati and Salt Lake. And he's like, I didn't know people remembered me. I'm like, Marty. And it was so great because a lot of the contemporary creators just surrounded him with questions. And he's like, John, I thought they forgot me. I'm like, Marty, come on, man. You were one of the main Superman writers for a real significant period of time, man.
Yeah, Marty was still just at the tail. I got there just as his tail end of time at DC Comics there too. So I got a chance to meet him. Really nice guy there as well. And for me it was Len and Marv, my two guys. When I was working in animation, I actually hired them as writers on shows that I was working on. And I actually, when I was story editing Reboot, I brought them in as writers on Reboot. And then we went over to War Planets and things of that nature. And I just love working with them, not just working with them because of the skills as writers, but also in downtime, I could pick their brains about comics. And Len was the guy I probably spent more time with at the start, and then Marv later on. But I used to want to hear all the stories, and I get the stories behind the scenes on all these things. I was always more interested in the behind the scenes than actually in some of the books themselves, and it sort of carried over to me when I came into my position at DC.
I do. That's great, Dan, and absolutely. And everybody, if you have questions about the DC years, I have a couple that I'm going to share with them. But I do want to talk about Defenders of the Universe. California doing a great job on art.
Jim and I worked together on two books that I did within the Frank Miller Presents line. He did two of the one-shots for me as part of my Ancient Enemies line of books, which was great. Had a fun time working with him. Great on this thing. He's a great action storyteller, so I got to make sure I got to get action in these books where he really just comes alive. I mean, I'm looking at the pages for issue 5 that comes out in March, and the action scenes just explode off the page, which gets me really excited. But I love working with that. For me, it was fun to work on these characters because, to be honest with you, I didn't know them that well. So I knew them from the cartoon, but I went back and I researched them and I read much about them. I went back to some of the runs. I actually had the Phantom run when it was a DC book, and I pulled that out and I went through that. But I have some old Alex Raymond, Flash Gordons. I went through some of that and like the big oversized books.
Sure.
And then I went hunting for Mandrake, which is like a bit of a holy grail trying to find that stuff.
I understand.
And I was able to get and extract enough information that I felt I had a base understanding of Defenders, but I wanted to bring in aspects of these characters from their other storytelling that I think their fans would recognize, not just be fans of the cartoon, but fans of the characters too. So 100%. It's been a blast, and it was a nice compliment to the book that I did with the people over at Condé Nast when we did the Shadow and the history of Street and Smith, which is again an area that I knew the characters, but I didn't know the backstory. And I love learning the background on all these characters. Love picking it all up and just putting all the pieces together and seeing how we get from point A all the way to where we are today, and especially characters that are around for 70, 80 years. It's amazing to see the journey these characters were on and how little and how much they changed at the same time.
Understood. And truly, Dan, I feel the same way. And that's why I really appreciated when IDW and Hermes and some of these other publishers would put out the big coffee table book collections of different adventure comics runs. I had never read Rip Kirby until the IDW books and things like that. And I'm a big Raymond fan. So was for Mandrake, was that Lee Falk as well as the Phantom being Lee Falk?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And here I'm gonna.
It was an interesting character because I didn't understand. I wanted to understand his magic. What was magic? What wasn't magic? Was it an illusion? Was it a stage show? And it was an interesting mix because they sort of played with it to make it feel like it's a stage production, but there was real magic behind it. So I thought that was an interesting twist for the character. And once you understood what the basic powers were, you had to set really parameters. So it wasn't just this constant magic being used to solve every problem, which, can happen with any magical character you throw into any story you tell.
Also, this gives you an opportunity to give more agency to Lothar, his sidekick.
You find really fascinating things. And Lothar is a really interesting character for me because, he's a chieftain, he's a king of 7 nations, and basically he forsakes that world to basically work and operate with Mandrake. And to be able to peel apart that character and explain some of his motivations for walking away was one of the things that I really wanted to dig into. And then the best part about the book, as is with the series, is the generational aspect. Everyone has a younger counterpart for the most part. And it was fun to start to develop in those characters, especially when you see somewhat of a generational divide, so much going on in culture in the world around us. It was great to be able to play those parallels within the book and story itself. Instead of just a bunch of kids learning from the adults are learning from the kids too. And I think that's an important aspect, so that there's a lot more respect on both sides. And the way the story's set up is that these kids were all 5 years older than they were in the cartoon. So because of that, there's a lot more learning that they've had and a lot more sense of independence and authority that they want to take on that chafes a little bit with the older characters.
I'm going to acknowledge some of the people watching. Artie Baltazar, already watching. Says,
"Hey, man, how are you?" Oh yeah,
Kari said, exactly. Oh yeah, man. Kari says, "Happy Thursday." And Pete Beiser says, "Dan, you've always been very kind to the fans over the years. Thank you, sir. Very cool." How is it? Is there an office at King Features that is vetting your ideas, and how's
actually, I probably get more notes from King Features than I get from Medcave, to be honest with you. It's clear that they're very much on board, and I'm happy to say they're very comfortable with the interpretations. Here's the thing. We talked about animation, my work in animation. I know what it's like to work with somebody's characters. I worked with a lot of toy companies. When I was at Mainframe, we did we did Max Steel, we did Beast Machines. So I knew what it was like to work with Hasbro. We dealt with the Barbie folks when we did the Barbie direct-to-video. So I knew what that was like too. Even with and one of the last things I did at Mainframe, believe it or not, was the Spider-Man show for MTV. So I had to sit in the offices with Avi Arad and all these guys telling me what you can and can't do and things of that nature. So I was always very aware of the needs of the licensor. And more importantly, I know what they were watching out for. And a lot of things that these guys watch out for are detrimental to storytelling, because they're protecting a brand, they're protecting a character, they're protecting things. So you have to be at least aware of that and respectful of it, but still be able to comfortably push. And the way I work around that is if you can logically explain the character's actions and behaviors, even if they might seem a little extreme based upon their core sensibilities, then you could take the licensor on the journey with you to tell that story. You know what I mean? And that makes it a little bit easier because there's a logical progression of the characters and storytelling that they can follow rather than something that can be jarring just for shock's sake or just for change sake,
I do. And again, I think you're walking a tightrope with some of these characters. I know from other friends that have written and drawn the Phantom, for example, and I know there's a lot of do's and don'ts when it comes to depicting the Phantom. Now, I saw the solicit for 5, which is, as you say, it's coming up in March. The first 4 are being collected, and you can buy them now at Mad Cave. You can buy them online, or if your stores have them. But also the trade collecting the first 4 that's coming out in February. Everybody. So, but you might tell from this image that there's another Phantom behind the one that's in the forefront. And this was an interesting wrinkle because, and I'll let you describe what's happening specifically with the Phantom and the Phantom legacy.
Well, the good part the fascinating thing about Defense of Earth cartoon was that it was developed by Marvel Studios. Okay. So, and if you look at the early episodes of it, Stan's associated as a story editor. And even when Marvel did their Star Comics version, Stan was the co-writer of the first issue. So it had a sensibility and a maturity that a lot of other animation didn't have. And you started to see this. A lot of stuff that was toy-based in the 80s going into the 90s that premiered in syndication and not on network was able to take a little bit more risks and be a little bit older in their sensibilities and tonality that I think helped keep them alive today in their own way. I think that's why Transformers and G.I. Joe exist. It's because they were able to put something in there and push the envelope a little bit further than they would have been allowed to get with in the networks. Having worked in the network, I know what broadcast standards does and how much they really neutered a lot of the material we did. I mean, I used to get a note when I was at ABC. I wasn't allowed to leave a character in jeopardy on a commercial, which seems like the most logical point to leave a character in jeopardy, because the object was put them in danger, make everybody excited, and wait out the commercials and come back.
Sure.
But their logic was, we don't want to give children anxiety that their character could be in danger for a period of time while the commercials are on, and we didn't want to stress them out. So I couldn't leave anybody in danger on a commercial break. And I'm like, what? How do I have an action show with no commercial, with no danger? So when I got to Mainframe and we did Reboot, the first thing we did was every scene, it looks like somebody's about to die in a commercial, because we weren't adherent to the networks at the time. And the syndicated shows had that same sensibility, and they were able to push that envelope a little bit further. I mean, believe it or not, I think in the 65 episodes of Defenders of the Earth, I think there's 2 drunk driving stories, which you think about it, in something that's dealing with the space affair. They're dealing with kids drinking in 2 episodes. And I'm like, that's weird. But, it showed you that they were trying to do something a little bit more than was expected. That might have been like a Filmation show in the 60s, so.
I understand. And that's really interesting. In fact, I know I just rewatched the old Batman animated series documentary, and they compared what they tried to do compared to what was done before it, like Hanna-Barbera and everything. Yeah. And they even showed like an old Super Friends where they were shrunk to miniature size, and there was like a giant mouse, and it's like, that's kind of dangerous. I don't know. And it's dangerous. Like, really?
I actually got a note once on Duck Dodgers in 24th and a half century from Broadcast Standards, saying that I wasn't allowed to show Marvin, the Martian, and Duck Dodgers shooting at each other, because what it represented was turf warfare, and they were dealing with gang issues in LA, and they didn't want to make it look like they were two opposite gangs fighting over land. And I'm serious. These are notes you would actually really get. And I'm like, do you know how many times this show has been on the air? If it was missing, it's going to be more obvious. And I wound up not running that episode simply because I would not make that cut.
Wow. No, I understand. Man, Marvin, I am a Crip, and I know Duck Dodgers is like blood.
But I mean, and I'm sorry, I'm digressing, but I have to say,
no, I love it.
One of the writers, actually a really great writer, a guy by the name of Ken Pontac, who created Bump in the Night. He made the classic mistake of sending an urban language dictionary to Broadcast Standards. And once she got her hands on that, all bets were off.
Wow.
Even fake a gag in there, because you would look it up and find out what we said and what we said and we're trying to say. So,
jeez, that's insane, Dan.
Yeah.
Oh my God. So, did you want to avoid answering the Phantom question? Because I mean,
Which,
I got
the Phantom question is right out. It's right out of the show. Kurt Warner is the older brother of Kit Warner, and Kurt is in the show, and he has weather powers, and he has something like that. I didn't play that gag, but I did. There's a whole machinations with Kit that basically remove him from the Phantom situation, and Kurt steps up, and we created what was called the Council of Phantoms, which is old. Our Phantom, Kit Walker, is the 27th Phantom, so it's basically 26 Phantoms passing judgment down on everyone. And
Sure.
And Jim did a great double page spread with all the different Phantoms, which I love because he was able to bring a personality to each one of them. And ultimately, we have the confrontation between Kurt and Kit, and ultimately Jeddah, which is Kit's daughter, is caught in the middle. She's being trained to be a Phantom by the uncle, and the father is trying to come in and show him that this is not the way to proceed. And ultimately, there's a big conflict between the three of them that we resolve in that issue. Which is
that's great. So that's the Phantom's daughter, and then you got Rick Gordon, Flash's kid, right?
Yep.
And who are the other kids?
It's LJ. LJ is the son of Lothar, and Kashin is the adopted son of Mandrake. So Kashin is an interesting character because he's the youngest one of the bunch. He's a good 5 years younger than the other guys, so little less mature, a lot more to prove. He's the one who's constantly making the mistakes because of trying to keep up with the others and try to overachieve, but in so creating problems along the way.
Okay, and I know you've written YA aged heroes and stuff. Your novel last time you were on.
I'm actually more comfortable with that than anything else. I think it's because of my animation days. That was my comfort spot. That's where I feel, and it's actually a lot more fun for me to write that. I can't get to that super hard edge that a lot of other people do, and I can't get to that super soft edge that a lot of people do too. So I'm sort of right there in the middle, just moving at my own pace and with a tonality that resonates with me and what I enjoyed when I was younger.
That's excellent, man. No, I had Jeremy Adams on to talk about the main Flash book, and I think it's great. And I'm glad that you and Jim have this opportunity with.
Yeah, it was good. I mean, listen, Jeremy's doing a great job on the Flash book, and what I did, I try to stay, even though Ming was the main focus and the main villain in the Defenders animated series, I moved him off. I brought his son in, Crotan, and I brought in his family.
I got a picture of Crotan
over here.
And
there's Crotan. And we brought him up. And so it's been great with that. It's been a blast, and, the presence of Ming is prevalent in the story. And in issue 6, you get behind the scenes with Crotan and get his motivations and find out what he's trying to do. And what's been fun also is I've done 2 short stories for the Flash Quarterly. So we get into what happened to Dale Arden in the first quarterly. And then, because that's the other thing that was interesting about the Defenders of the Earth TV show, Dale, never mentioned by name, is killed in the first episode. And becomes somewhat of an AI character throughout this series, but they don't really explore that. And we got a chance to do it a little bit more within our series. And then in the second one shot, when it comes out, I'm not sure when that comes out, in the Flash Quarterly, we explore Ming and what happened to him in his final days. Leading into the story. Yeah.
That's really cool. No, I've talked to, I want to say Lewis Southard wrote one of the Flash Quarterly stories, and I talked to him about that. But yeah, it's, no, honestly, I am so impressed with what Mad Cave is doing with the King Feature characters.
Yeah.
They're getting
I never you know what? I almost did, and then I stopped myself. I almost went and read the Dynamite stuff that was done, King's Row.
Yes.
I almost went there, and I almost bought it, and I said, don't. Stick to the cartoon. Stay away from what everything else was going on. And, that way I use the cart. I have this animated series, 65 episodes as a base to draw things from. I'd rather I have enough to pick from here. So I didn't want to see what other people did, because you're always going to come. These ships are always going to scrape paint at some point.
Sure.
Because you're dealing with the same characters, the same world, almost the same worlds, and the same interactions. Because the one thing about Phantom and Mandrake and Flash is the consistency in their actions and behaviors throughout generations of storytelling, to the point that it's sort of ingrained in how they should act and behave. So when you put them in environments together, you're going to get that same dynamic no matter what.
I understand. No, that's great, Dan. And also, are the cartoons streaming anywhere, or are they on
I
YouTube?
believe you had mentioned places like Tubi and things like that. I think Defense of the Earth are on Tubi.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. That's cool. God, have you seen there's some people on YouTube that have recreated like literally like 4 hours of Saturday morning cartoons from specific years. And really like 60s stuff and 70s, and they've been thrown in like old commercials. I was going to say when you were saying that you didn't want suspense, they didn't want suspense, but between segments when they went to commercial, it's like, yeah, the kids got to choke down their alphabets, man. They can't be nervous about what's going to happen.
Yeah, I had a 5-disc DVD player, and I used to put in 5 different shows and just watch them rotate through. So yeah, I know what that's like.
That pilot movie, and I remember that it actually ran in prime time on NBC, and I've seen the documentary about that NBC commissioned this thing and wanted a live action show, and then everybody saw the budget, and it's like, yeah, let's make it animation.
Yeah,
but I mean, that Flash Gordon series obviously really took cues from the original Saturday serials, the cliffhangers and everything.
Yeah.
But I thought that was great, and I thought the Defenders was a nice spinoff. It was a little more juvenile, but
the hardest part about Defenders, it's not the hardest part. I've always I stupidly gravitate to team books, which is the toughest thing to do constantly, because you're constantly trying to find time to make sure everybody gets a chance to at least speak or active in each story. And I try to change the focus in every issue so that everybody has a little bit of a moment. So that's been intriguing. Like I said, the issue 5 is a Phantom book. We get into issue 6, it's a Crotan centric story. Issue 7, it's probably Mandrake, and then we wrap up with Flash at the end. Lothar we've done beforehand, and so everybody has a chance, at least an issue where they get a chance to explore who they are a little bit, which is, I think, is important. But finding that dynamic, I mean, it reminds me of the days when I used to sit and talk to Len about his writing Justice League, which I was a huge fan of. Len Wein's Justice League book, monstrous fan of that. And he would tell me stories about how he would find different ways to team up different characters for different story dynamics. Because if you have a character that's clearly defined, then you can mix and match your characters and get a different beat based upon how they play together. And I always kept that in mind, that you always want to mix up that. That's why when you see me, when I'm writing, I'm not writing Lothar and Mandrake. We've seen that. That's natural. So I'm putting Mandrake with Phantom. I'm putting Lothar with Flash. I'm doing things where you mix up the characters so you get a different story sensibility with these two characters coming together.
I totally understand that. So are the kids like, is Rick having a moment with Mandrake? I mean, is it that kind of mix and match as well?
The thing is that I had Rick and the father. I wanted to explore the relationship a little bit more because I had them part. Then I reintroduced Dale in a certain way that brings that dynamic into a new mix. Then he's ultimately relearning his relationship with LJ and things of that nature. So I'm trying to the thing is that when you have 8 characters, somebody's going to get on the outs. You can't do everything. But my main focus is doing the 4 leads and playing up their bits and their storytelling, and then using the rest of the characters to be to support them in their story.
Okay, I understand. Mike Jones lets us know there's a YouTube channel called Comics Kingdom that is owned by King Features, has all the 80s DOE or Doe cartoon episodes. And I'm so glad that Mike mentioned, the Phantom series 2040 was a really interesting future look at the Phantom.
That was a real. I forgot who the designer was. That I want to say it's the same guys behind. Was it Colossal? Might have been. I used to know all the animation studios, and I think it was Colossal. They had done work over for MTV on some series there, and then they brought them over to do Phantom 2024, which brought a really unique look on that. Fascinating stuff.
Yeah, I'm with you, man. All right, a couple questions from the Peanut Gallery. Bob Riedel wants to know, tell us about getting Grant Morrison to come back to DC. He thinks you're the guy who talked him into it and believes that resulted in him doing All-Star Superman.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, Grant was on my wish list when I got to DC Comics. He was working at Marvel at the time. I had actually met Grant when the first few months I was there. Karen Berger brought him in to meet me. Came in with his wife, Kristen. Love them both dearly. And Grant pitched me a concept called Crisis in Hypertime, which would have been our first big event during my time at DC. And I pitched it to Paul, and Paul, in the middle of the pitch, told me how much he wasn't a fan of the whole hypertime concept. And I wound up packing up my bag and pulling it out, and we went back and revisited. And then Grant had done X-Men, and we tried to figure out how to do it. And it was actually at San Diego Comic-Con that Grant signed the deal, and I was very much about getting him to come over. I needed that crazy sense of energy that came with him, and the big ideas that come along with Grant Morrison. And I always wanted Grant Superman. Grant understood Superman better than anyone, you know. And I can say this now. I mean, All Star Comics was, in my mind, was supposed to be our Ultimates line, in a weird way, you know. And ultimately, you know, I wanted to create something that really stood apart from the line, but encapsulated everything. And the challenge to Grant on All Star Superman was an interesting one. We wanted to get I used to tell the story about how if you wanted to read Batman, there's 50 different great books you could pick out and read a great Batman story. But if you really wanted to read a great Superman trade, they were few and far between. You know what I mean?
I do.
Very few and far between. And I needed that great Superman trade that you could point to, go, what's Superman about? And so we went to Grant and asked him to do this and create this. And he had this great Superman. And I think one of the things that I didn't realize until he pointed it out to me, that's how good it is that every character in that story is an original character for the most part. Nothing's extrapolated from past history or past books. He basically created all new characters to tell this story. And they're so well crafted and created that they felt like they were pre-existing. They were so deeply, you know, developed that when they landed in here, you felt that they had a past history that I just didn't know existed. And the fact of the matter, it was just his creation. And I think All-Star Superman as a volume is probably the strongest Superman story you can tell from beginning, middle, and end. You know, it's just incredible telling. You know, but on the other side of Grant, let's talk about everything else. For me, what Grant did, you know, I could go on for Grant for hours. So
all good. No, I think people want to hear these stories. Keep going.
I mean, was his Seven Soldiers of Victory was a monster that I wanted to do desperately. And Grant, one thing about Grant is really interesting. You could throw him a curveball, or there has to be an editorial edict that they would say that could upset his storytelling, and he finds a way around it every time. And with Seven Soldiers, Martian Manhunter was part of that team, and we had to pull him. And and he just but that brought the Frankenstein character in, which I think was even better at the end of the day. And you know, and then when Grant goes on Batman, Grant pitched me like a 7-year arc on Batman. That story was laid out from beginning, middle, and end. And we relaunched the line twice in the middle of that story. And he still got a way to complete it and tell it to, including the fact that the whole story is built about Batman dying, and we told them that halfway through it is that Batman can't die. So we had all this happening, and Unwavering still found a way to craft that story without missing a beat. And honestly, I can say this, probably during my time at DC, two of my favorite beats of Batman was I loved Judd Winick's Batman. I just loved it to death.
Oh yeah,
with the Red Hood storyline.
Yes,
and I loved Grant's introduction of Damian and Damian as a character. I love that character. I thought it was brilliant. And he told me this. It was the fact, you know. And you got to. I don't know if you haven't experienced comics until you've been pitched by Grant Morrison, by the way. And he can. And it's just an incredible pitch. And he pitched me the whole thing, and he explained to me, and it was so clear that, and this is something that a lot of people do. Like, they put other people in the Batman suit, but they still act and behave and talk like Batman. And what Grant did was that when Dick Grayson put on the Batman suit, it was still Dick Grayson. It was not Bruce Wayne. It was Dick Grayson in that suit, clearly. But in order to keep the dynamic alive, he made Robin the angry, mean character, and the light character is Batman. He kept the paradigm of Batman and Robin, but flipped the leads.
Yep.
And it's brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
And still some of the best stuff. And, you know, when you had the Frank Quietly art and you have all this other stuff going on here, it's just magic, you know?
You read my mind, because, Quietly on both Batman and also All-Star Superman. Yeah. I loved the way, and you know, Chris Reeve did it in the movie, but the way that Frank would draw Clark, kind of hunched over and a meek look on his face, and then all of a sudden he'd straighten up and there's Superman and stuff. No, that stuff is beautiful.
I remember that first cover coming in with Superman sitting on the cloud. I'm like, huh.
Isn't it? I'll get to the comments in a second, but isn't it interesting? Because I really felt Grant, James Robinson, a lot of these Europeans, and specifically British, and I don't, I know Grant is very proud of being Scottish, so I don't mean to diminish him by referring to him as a British man. But yeah, they came with this different perspective. I mean, certainly Alan did too, and Dave.
I'm going to tell you what that perspective is, because I asked them. It's a perspective of the America from the outside. And they looking at America. They're again, if you're in Europe or anywhere else, you're fed a lot more of news from the United States than the United States is filled with news from the rest of the world.
Absolutely.
So they're seeing a lot more of us. So they see the allegories and the interpretations of the American idealisms and ideas, and they see that from their perspective overseas. And they interpret those themes and ideas through their lens into our characters. So they bring the idealisms of America into our characters and are able to extrapolate personality traits that really are things that we might not see here ourselves, because they're too far in the weeds. You know what I mean? You're living around it all the time. You lose sight of it. But they can see it very clearly and be able to extrapolate those themes and find a way to tell stories and use the DC characters as allegories for those stories while still keeping the personality of them. And that's where that comes from. And I like I said, I used to sit with Grant and these guys with long dissertations about characters and characters and characters. And I think that's why there was a freshness to the interpretations of the DC characters when during that UK invasion during the 80s, that really played out, all the way, actually still probably playing out to today, with people being, affected by that material. But I mean, that was the thing that was fascinating to me. Me, I love talking comics. People used to joke. I said, I was glad I wasn't at DC during COVID. I would have been knocking on people's windows just so we could talk comics through the glass, not through the screen.
Hey man, I remember you did that episode with the Oh Yeah guys when you were sorting your comimics and stuff.
Oh so, yeah, we know. I went through all my old stuff. I did it all a couple of times, and it's still, it's still, an important part of me, but not the only part of me.
But that's truly great, Dan, because honestly, I always say, coming from broadcast radio, and I'm still a big radio and broadcast nerd.
Yeah.
But by the same token, especially when I was working in sports, I'm like the last thing. I watched what I had to watch, but otherwise, like sports became my job, and it wasn't as fun. Because I had to do it for the job and stuff. So it's great that you've retained that.
I even, like I said, I did a few years in soap operas, and I could tell you every character's name, every storyline, everything going on. I knew everything about everything.
That was ABC, right?
I could tell you I have no idea anymore. That part of me is gone. It's all gone.
Was that ABC, Dan?
What's that?
Was that ABC?
ABC, yeah. ABC, yeah. I did All My Children, One Life to Live, and Loving. Those are my 3 shows.
I remember Loving. Hilarious.
Yeah.
God, and isn't it crazy now? GH, General Hospital's the only one left standing over there.
Because like I said, I was there when Sarah Michelle Gellar started at ABC.
Yes,
an interesting time.
Erica Kane's daughter. Yeah.
Michael Weatherly was one of these guys who just came in out of nowhere, and all of a sudden he blew up on NCIS. So it's crazy to see some of these guys become big deals out of these shows.
Absolutely. God, yeah, man. Sarah Michelle Gellar was amazing as and I forget her name. Sky? No, Sky was
no. I forgot. You know what? I tell you the truth, I forgot. I'm one of the few people that actually spoke to them by their real names and not their character names. Anywhere else you go, everybody knew them by their character names.
Sure.
So I made it a purpose to say everybody's real name.
That's hilarious.
With Jeannie Francis and Jonathan Frakes, and those were interesting times too.
Okay, thank you. And Jerry, yes, she was Kendall. And it's funny because Scott
Kendall, there you go. Thank you, Jerry.
Yes.
Thank
Great.
God watch the show.
Oh God, no, Dan. From high school through my early working years in the early '90s and stuff, I was all about all the Greg and Jenny and Erica and Kendall and Mike, the writer that Erica was with, Mike Roy. Yeah. Come on, man.
One of my funniest stories with All My Children is Kim Hunter was a guest star on All My Children, and I was supposed to meet her at the entrance and then bring her up, and I was supposed to bring her to the rooms. I was supposed to make sure she was taken care of, and I found out she got in past me. For some reason, I didn't see her enter, and she was ahead of me in the hall, and I hear a voice. All right, I hear a voice, just a voice, and I'm yelling. I'm telling, could you wait? And I scream Zira on the top of my lungs. I don't know where that came from. I shouldn't say that. I know exactly where that came from. I just can't believe it came out of me. And I catch up to her, and I am embarrassed, beet red. And she just looks at me, laughs, and she goes, "I get that all the time."
Of course. God, I'm sure you've seen that David Niven World War II movie, A Matter of Life and Death, where she's the love interest. And it's
really? There you go. Yeah,
it's so great. And it's an interesting fantasy. It's got a very Heaven Can Wait vibe to it. Or here comes Mr. Jordan, but in a different way. And she's fantastic. And again, we were talking about old detective shows. She's in a Columbo. She's in a lot of those Universal detective procedural stuff. No, I love Kim Hunter, and of course, come on, Zira.
I like Kim Hunter. I worked Celeste Holm, Ruth Warwick. A lot of
Ruth Warwick, Jesus,
fabulous.
Yeah, man,
incredible people.
And Ruth Warwick, for people who don't know, of course, Citizen Kane played Orson Welles' wife, but for decades played Phoebe Wallingford. So yeah. And the guy who was her boyfriend, who used to be on Dark Shadows, and I forget his name.
Oh, David Canary. No,
but David Canary was awesome too.
Oh, Louis Edmonds.
There you go, man. Oh God, no, Dan, I'm telling you.
This shows you how psychotic I am too, though, by the way. So during my days working publicity for ABC soaps, I was working with Walt Willey, who was the love interest with Susan Lucci's character.
Yes.
Also, big comic book fan. So we used to talk comics all the time. And I managed to work out a guest appearance of Walt Willey in Second Life of Dr. Mirage with Valiant Comics, just because I wanted to have that comic book tie. So we actually worked it out that his character appears in an issue of Second Life of Dr. Mirage in Valiant back in the early 90s. Yeah.
That's funny.
That was like a crown jewel for me at that point. I got a chance to do comic stuff,
I'm pretty sure he was married to Christine Ebersol, the actress. And she went to my high school, and at the time,
I have stories with Walt that we're not allowed to do on air.
Well, this is a Walt story too that we can tell on the air. But she came back to our high school to talk to the theater kids because she was touring with Camelot with Richard Burton.
Okay, wow.
But Walt came along, this is at the height of Walt, his popularity. Everybody had questions for Walt. And she's like, "Hey, I'm the one who went to this school. Doesn't anyone want to talk to me?"
Yeah, no shit. The reach, but that honestly, the soap opera audience. Once I understood that audience, it helped me really start to understand the comic book audience.
Of course,
you do. That level of dedication and commitment and obsession in some ways about who they are and what they do and how they behave, and they know their lives better than the actors.
I'm so glad that CBS is sticking with soaps, and even though it's only GH that ABC is. And I got to meet Jeannie at Terrificon in Connecticut with Jonathan, and it was great because I interviewed Jonathan on Zoom before we did it. I'm like, "Hey man, no, I don't mean to sound creepy, but please," I go, I had the biggest crush on Jeannie, and I still do." And he goes, "Oh no, I'm telling her, she loves shit like that." I'm like, "All right,
totally." No, she was great.
That's funny. Ed Cato says, "Yay for Dan." Excellent. Very nice. Good to see you, Ed. Glad you're watching, man. Alex says that All-Star Superman was a great conclusion to DC 1 million. Did you see it that way, Dan?
No, not at all. I saw it.
I was going to say, I didn't either, man.
Yeah, I think you got to understand Grant. He has the interpretation in his mind. And he sees the character the same character appearing in other stories. So I'm not surprised that it feels like the same Superman, because that's the Superman that Grant writes. You know what I mean? But it definitely was a story that had a beginning, middle, and end. That's how All-Star Superman was crafted. Along those lines.
I do. That's great. So Dan, you brought that TV writer room mentality. I know that the Superman editors during the 90s. During the Doomsday period, and certainly the the period where we had weekly Superman issues and stuff. And I know Carlin,
Yeah.
assuming kind of ran things the same way. But tell me about bringing that mentality to 52.
I mean, yeah, with 52 series, I mean, I had an idea on that. And my issue was that I wanted to create a story that was told in the speed in which the delivery system worked. Meaning, if we get comics every week, I wanted to put one story out every week so that way it became a destination book. It forced everybody to go in on Wednesday to get that one book and then see what else was coming out around the same time. And what I did is we did the writer's room first. We got the writers together. And each writer had its own sensibility. I mean, Jeff was the writer of the present. He was the voice. He was becoming the lead voice of the DC universe at that moment. You saw that starting to congeal. And then Greg Rucka was the grounded voice. He was down deep in the trenches. He was telling the street stories. Then you had Grant Morrison telling the big, crazy, epic size stories and bringing the scope to things, this incredible scope to it. And then you had Mark coming in really historian, telling the history, knowing the history of DC. So you're carrying these 4 different quadrants. Everybody's coming at it from a slightly different angle. So you had the writer room set. And then what I did is I brought in Keith Giffen. Now, Keith is basically not just the den mother in the room. He's also the muscle in the room. He's the enforcer in the room. He's the storyboard artist. So literally every script that came in, Keith thumbnailed the entire script. So that way, just like you would storyboard an animated series, so therefore, if one artist was running late, you could take the thumbnails and hand it to a different artist and still have the art be consistent in the series. Because what I was worried about is once it was collected, I didn't want these jarring turns of art between issues because it would psychologically break the momentum of the storytelling while you're reading it. So you wanted to have this level of consistency. And Keith brought the consistency in the storytelling by being the storyboard artist for all 52 issues. Then you had the consistency of J.G. Jones on the covers of that because you wanted to have that. And it was essential that the covers told story too. They just weren't pinups. I was never a fan of pinup covers. And J.G.'s covers were so strong and they were all in the room together. So while they're working, everybody's in the room together. And J.G. would, sit there and sketch. And as the story goes, there's an issue where there's an Aborigine with Red Tornado's head underneath the arm as a cover. And that was just a JG sketch that everybody loved so much, they worked it into the story.
Wow.
So it was a fascinating thing. Now, the interesting part was the original conceit of 52, the weekly series, was that we did a 1 year later jump. And theoretically, we're going to have all this crazy stuff happen from point A to point B. And all this would generate story that we would find a way to place within the body of the 52 weekly series. Lo and behold, though, the writers called me into a room after they read all the 1 year later jumps, and he goes, "Hey, they're kind of uneven. There's some that work and a lot that don't work. And the bottom line is that we don't have a story. We don't have a story. And you have this moment where you have to make a decision, and this happens a couple of times in 52. And with 52." We have this moment where do we try to stick to the original conceit of what it was to fill this 1 year later jump, or do I let these guys just go and craft their own things? And so the choice was made, let them go, craft their own story. And that's when they go off and create something. And I call it, that's when they turn into the unimind. It's 4 minds working as one. They were all very respectful of each other. And they all manage their own areas, their own characters. And if there was a problem, it was either myself or Keith, the ones that had to resolve any sort of issues along the way, because they would never confront each other working together in unison. And they're very tight about that. So that was good. And there was this key moment where there's a cover of one issue. It's early in verse 10. There's a giant hawk girl on the cover, and it comes into my office. And I call the editors in, and I go, "Giant hawk girl." I said, Did we mention a giant hawk girl in the missing year? And they go, "No, we didn't. This is taking a character, moving in another direction." I'm like, you give that sigh, like, "Oh shit, here we go." And you basically have to go, do we just let it go, or do we take it out and put something else in that doesn't contradict other things that we've done? And at that point, we were so far vested, and these guys were so invested in the material and so along the lines, we had to step back and go, okay, just let them go and clear the rest of the way. And the goal was to protect that book at every step of the way to make sure that it ran. And the rest of the line in some places suffered because we made one major miscalculation, and it was a major miscalculation. When you're writing a book and everybody say they were all equivalent of doing 5 pages each over a week. So 5 pages each at the end of the month, you have 20 pages. That's like equivalent of one book.
Sure.
And Greg was very appropriately informed me, not even close to true. Writing those 5 pages were more difficult than writing a 20-page comic because you're trying to put as much information and tie it up and build it up. And you would sit in the same amount of meetings and the same amount of conversation to create a single issue. So what deemed to be the workload of a single book wound up being the workload of 4 books in a month. Wow. So they took on this extra load, and then these guys who had other assignments, the other assignments started to suffer. And we had to juggle, and books were running late, and things are happening, and it became difficult. But we managed it. And Keith always says the success of New 52 was based on NASCAR, that people kept on waiting for the book to crash. And we made every choice not to, and including Marvel poaching our editor, a key editor on the book, halfway through the series.
Right, Steve, right? Wasn't it Steve?
Steve, yeah, Steve comes in, takes it, and good for him. You got to follow your dream. Then I remember Mike Siglain, who was assistant editor, associate editor, pulled him into the office, basically pinned him against the wall, shaking him, going, we will not let this book fail.
It didn't fail, Dan. It was one of the great moments.
The good and the bad is that the good and the bad of everything is you want this to wrap up and everybody wants to take a bow and take a breath. And the problem was when you're in, just like soap operas, you're on every day. You don't have any reruns. I had to have something else going to me. And I presented a schedule to accounting and everybody about what we plan to do. And everybody goes, okay, what are you doing to replace these 4 books that were selling 90,000 copies a week? Which, because if you think about it, it's 4 titles, not 1.
Right, all the chapters every month. Yeah, absolutely.
And it was the average. I think the average on 52 finished up at about 90 to 92,000 issues per week. And
I get it.
It is what it is. And that's when we accelerated Countdown and Final Crisis, and we moved it up a year because we needed something with the same speed, and it served its purpose, but you could see the strain on the, as I call it, the studio, which is the facility, that it was starting to show signs of breaking because we were pushing everyone so hard doing this on a regular basis, and it was tough to keep up that pace. The guys on Final Crisis, I thought, still did a great job doing it, and but it was gruesome, and then we followed up again with Trinity, which was another weekly series.
Yes.
Each time we kept on changing the paradigm and how it worked, and with Trinity, it was Kurt Busiek and Mark Bagley, basically doing the whole book, and that was interesting. And then we wrapped up with the final weekly series, which was Wednesday Comics.
Oh, of course, Wednesday Comics. Yes,
we threw our hands up and said, "That's it, we're done for a while."
Dan, again, Wednesday Comics was such an achievement, and
that was Mark Chiarello. It was a brilliant idea with Mark. It was something that was a passion project. Mark Chiarello, had so many interesting things. It was. I tell these stories. I can tell these stories now. I mean, New Frontier was sitting in his drawers. Excuse the expression. What happened was what I used to do is, there was an expectation that editors would have material that would never see print, that you're going to do. And we had a slush fund of about 10% of our budget put aside for throwing stuff away that didn't work. Right. So I was looking for stuff and every once in a while I would go in and look for stuff to publish. What do you have that we didn't publish that maybe we can publish? So Chiarello had New Frontier literally sitting in his drawers. And I said, why isn't this published? This is gorgeous. And I was looking for something with Darwin at that point. And he goes, well, it didn't fit DC continuity at the time. And I'm like, what?
Yeah.
So we sort of just let it go. We pushed it out, and we pushed it out. And that was a blast. And that thing became a monster unto itself, a thing unto itself. I always wanted to do a John Henry book, believe it or not. He had that one little thing with John Henry in the corner. I always wanted to do, and we never came to figure out how to make that work, which was a shame. It
Did
was
any
such an interesting thing in the corner that I thought can add to. I was always looking for things to add to the DCU, not just constantly retell it.
sure
And that felt like a good addition that could have been part of it, and just never came together.
did did you pursue any people like and right now I'm blanking on names, but some of the writers of color that are guys like poor
Always.
Dwayne McDuffie
Yeah,
and
yeah. I mean, honestly, we did. I mean, I was dancing with Dwayne McDuffie on and off several times to the point that he came in and took over Justice League for a period of time as well.
Yes.
We're always trying to find that mix, trying to find the right people. I mean, it's at that point we're just you're just trying to get the best books out the door and wherever the ideas were. And realistically, the way we worked is that we came up with the big idea on top, and then it was fed down to the editors. And the editors brought it out, and then brought back suggestions, and we played mix and match along the way. See what was the best way to pull this all together. I put a lot of people under contract at DC when I was there as executive editor because Marvel was so aggressive in going after DC talent that I had to find a way to remove that threat from losing the talent. And I think I told someone this the other day that we were, I think at our high point, we had 147 talent under contract.
Wow.
Which was great. But the sad part is when you let somebody off contract, they get angry at you because they don't think you love them anymore. And it's not the case. It's just there was a level of work that was being committed to that you brought them in to do. And when that work wasn't there, it's not that we didn't want to work with them. It's just that we couldn't make that same level of commitment. And it would serve this great sense of camaraderie and built this incredible family. And at the same time, then you started to go to the family reunions where people were pissed at you because you weren't paying attention to them. So, there's a good and bad of everything, as I like to say. It's an interesting thing,
Mentioning Dwayne and the Justice League inspires another question. When J. Michael Straczynski took over Wonder Woman and Superman, and I've read his autobiography, and I in fact interviewed him for his autobiography, we didn't know as readers at the time that Joe got a bad medical review and he thought he was going blind.
Yeah,
and it sounded like that might have been the reason why he pulled away from the books. But regarding Dwayne, I appreciated his frustration because you had a guy that was killing it on the Justice League cartoon and telling these intricate stories, that were 19, 20 minutes long without the commercials.
Right.
And, that Justice League, I mean, people who don't like JLA Detroit, go, oh God, Vibe, Gypsy, whatever. And Dwayne had the same issue where you had Elongated Man and Plastic Man, everybody but A-listers. And he would, he kind of told us online, hey, I want to use the Atom. No. Hey, I want to use Hawkman. Yeah. No. So from the editorial standpoint, what was going on? Did Joe have a deal that while he was writing Wonder Woman and Superman that no one else could write them?
It's what we were trying to really have an interconnected universe, and unfortunately when you do that, that's where the team books become problematic. If you look at the story of the Avengers, they get rid of a lot of the characters early on and bring in Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch just 100%. So they didn't have that problem. Absolutely. And my hope was always that we can make these other characters more interesting to me, because for me, the Justice League is more interesting with a character team that comes together to present the same power and strength as one of the lead members of the Trinity. I didn't, and I also, we moved some of the milestone characters. He was able to use those in those story times too. So I was trying to find ways to keep his interest in that. But, the frustration just builds, and if you have an intricate storyline going on here and trying to make it work with the other ones, it becomes difficult. It just does. And, it's the double-edged sword of comic storytelling. People want that continuity, but they want that creative freedom. And sometimes they just come in conflict with each other. And a lot of people who just want to tell stories can't be bogged down by that, And I was very fortunate in my early stages of DC where we were working to the same goal and bringing the characters in. And I tell the story that when I first got there, I was, to tell you the truth, I still feel like the outsider to comics because I had a whole career before I came to comics, so I didn't have that growing up in the industry. I came in top down. So it's a completely different perspective when you're coming in top down than you do when you rise up through the ranks, and there's a frustration and there's a lot of anxiety that comes along with that on everybody's part. And when I first got there, I was butting heads with editorial nonstop. So much so that I was trying to push the storyline through, and the way I did it was working through the talent and let the talent pitch the story to the editors rather than me as executive editor.
Wow.
And that's when my friendship with Jeff and Judd and Greg became the strongest, because between the three of them, they were managing not only every major character and major team, but they also were driving a story that they all negotiated together. So that's why in those early days, up through Infinite Crisis, you get this real tight continuity, because it was created as a group and executed as a group as part of their natural storytelling, not something being forced down as an editorial edict. And that's why that worked, and why 52 works is because they work together telling the story, Then at the end, when you try to drive things forward, and the problem is that once you get the character in the corner, you got to keep on telling stories. So sooner or later, the new stories are going to put you in conflict with the old stories, and that's when the trouble starts, and it becomes difficult, with the handoffs and the turns. It's interesting. I was just reading some old Marvels back in the 70s. And one of the things I find fascinating about old Marvel 70s is you see a writer, you change writers in the middle of an ongoing story. Like somebody else picks up the other. This is in DC Challenge. They pick up a cliffhanger and they move that story on. And it's almost seamless in a weird way. You feel like it's a natural extension. Even if the writer is taking it in a brand new direction, you didn't get that sense of it because there was this understanding between the two. And, it comes down to respecting the other talent, respecting the other stories. And putting your own personal desires aside to really work to the bigger picture. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. And it depends on where you are, at the time, but so much of what we like and what people remember is that when the universe works in unison,
Sure.
That's why you brought up Mike and Superman. Mike was brilliant editor on Superman. Brilliant. I mean, honestly, just seamless. Talk about seamless storytelling. The problem is they told so many great stories that when he stepped off, where do they go? And they wind up with Superman Red and Superman Blue, because
Right.
all the other big stories were told. They burned through so much storytelling when they were there. By the time they stepped away, the guys are working with scraps, and they were trying to build something new, and they were trying to find someplace to go. And there's going to be that period of time where you're struggling to find your own voice and direction. And then because everything's in print and everything stays in trade, you're constantly being held against previous examples. So, in the old days, comics were disposable. They were gone. Nobody saw the old, nobody knew what Steve Ditko did unless you read a reprint somewhere. So
Sure.
you can go do your own thing and not be held to that standard along the way, and create your own new standard as you go. But now we're constantly I love when people come to me and go, oh, it's not as good as Dark Knight. I said, yeah, right. What is? So if that's your standard, then you're going to be constantly disappointed, about everything that comes out. So you have to accept what it is for the moment, what it is, and enjoy it in the moment rather than compare it against this 80-year history that exists in the past,
Yeah, but the problem is that, like you said, I mean, these things stay in print now. And so, again, someone can grab Dark Knight now and everything. What about New 52, Dan? Because I understand, and it was hard to get the people that they let me talk to were guys like Bob Wayne and John Cunningham, for example, and if I remember correctly.
Okay.
And I understand that certainly the push was, start fresh, new number ones, new ideas and stuff. But man, some of these ideas were so dramatically different. The divisions within the Superman family.
Yeah.
Between Clark and Kara.
That's the biggest failing. Was the between George and Grant had just two different approaches, and George was really and the problem with a lot of things it's not a problem. It's just what it is. It's not a problem. It's people with long-term success and long-term history really want to execute what they want to execute. Tell the story they want to tell. If I'm going to tell a Superman story, I want to tell my Superman story, not your Superman story.
Right.
You know what I mean? And it's fair. They earn that right. You know what I'm saying? So you have to make those decisions along the way. But we really needed a lot of what we wanted to do with change with Superman. I really loved Grant's Superman.
Yeah, it was an interesting story.
I love what he was trying to do. It's just something different. And the goal was to do something different. The goal with New 52, again, everything is it's easy to look at it 10 years later and call whatever you want. But the reality is the market was very soft at that moment, extraordinarily soft. What happened was that we had a peak we were on a good roll from Countdown to Infinite Crisis all the way to Blackest Night. But the wheels are starting to come off the bus after Blackest Night. Brightest Day did not land well. And the market itself, not just DC, but the entire market was in a slide. Top selling book in 2010, 2011, around there was about 60,000 copies, down from 200 something, So you're in this period where you come into a trough, and Jim and I step in as co-publishers. And I remember saying to Jim, I don't want to be the guy that's in charge when the ship goes under. You know what I mean? And we had to do something. We had new bosses. They wanted to reposition everything. They were very focused on Burbank. They were very focused on media. We wanted to do something that became a breath of fresh air that people could go in and pick up, and they could take into the studio and say, hey, look at here. You don't have to read 80 years of comics or 70 years of comics at that time. Got something for you right here. You can read. And the goal was to really freshen it up and spend time. And the first year, we spent a lot of energy really inventing new, and really spending the time and figuring it out and working it. For me, what I was most focused on was other, meaning I was focused on Animal Man. I was focused on iVampire. I was focused on Men of War. I was focused on All-Star Western. I wanted other in the line. I wanted to create an opportunity or platform where the other franchise, other styles and genres of storytelling had an opportunity to be seen as part of this big bubble, and everybody talks about Superman and Batman and all this other stuff. And I go over here going, hey, look at this. This was, this was GI Combat, and this was, and this was Animal Man, and this was, all these crazy ideas for me, that's what DC Comics represented. I was always I like the other stuff in DC Comics more so than just the superhero stuff. And I wanted to see that succeed. So it gave me a chance to create a platform. And we had new management. We were trying to make ourselves seen. And for me, again, as co-publisher with Jim at that time, contrary to, as executive editor, you're worried about telling stories and characters. So the Infinite Crisis days is my golden moment there because it executed everything I envisioned it to be. As a publisher, you got to make money. You got to please your bosses. You've got to bring the team together. And ultimately, we had a lot of change that took place when new management came in. So we had to bring the team together, and we united the company around New 52. So as a company initiative, it really brought this new structure within DC together and brought it because, with Paul leaving and who's there and was so instrumental in such a history of DC, not being there, you needed a new uniting point, something to unite behind him. And one thing about DC is, especially the New York offices, people love the characters, love comics. And so we gave them a reason to love comics and to get involved again. And it became an all-in for the entire company, which was really a really good thing overall. And I think ultimately it did. Now, what happens is as you go forward and as you start to see it, I think expectations are too high to believe that we're going to maintain high sales on 52. We got a little arrogant. We thought we were going to be able to keep it higher. And we created what I call the churn. And the churn is the bottom 8, 12 books that weren't working. And you spent all your energy trying to make these books that weren't working work. And you lose sight of the stuff that's on the big end, the high end, that you should be focusing on. So as you're doing new stories with the bigger characters, you sort of, instead of spending the time to rethink every story through, you're sort of dusting off an old character and bring him back. I'll just change the color. I'll change a different hat. I'll give him a feather in his ear. I don't know, in order to make him work differently. And ultimately, that's when the fans start getting confused. Wait, that's sort of like it. And then you get writers in who are fighting just to get the old versions back. They're online, waving a flag saying, I'm going to bring you your version of this character. And it's like, we're not here to fight about this. We're here to execute best stories. And why can't we work with the parameters here? And it becomes this thing that ultimately became unwieldy because trying to do too much and too much. So once we realized the churn was killing us, then we put the focus back on the beginning again. But to be honest, Rebirth was always in the back pocket. I always, Rebirth served us well with Green Lantern, and I always say, well, Green Lantern, Rebirth, the start of everything we're trying to do in a weird way. So I always knew that we're going to have to do an overall rebirth of the line at some point. I thought we'd get 5 years. We got about 4 and 4.25, so it's sort of about right. And 5 years is about the attention span of something before it starts to need to be refreshed in a weird way. It used to be 10, but all timelines are collapsing these days, and the need for these things to focus. But what it was at the start, the first 2 years, extraordinarily proud of what we try to do and what accomplished. As a publisher, you accomplish everything you hope to do. Were there stories in there I liked and didn't like? Yeah, of course, because I'm not going to be a fan of 52 books ever. Just not. But I am going to be a fan of the dedication and execution of that material. And the goal was really to create a much more stronger. One of the things I always focused on is bringing a much more stronger visual sense to DCU. I mean, we tell the story and we joke about it, about when I first got to DC. One of the first things I started doing was poaching artists from Wildstorm. I love the artist of Wildstorm. And I used to find, hey, is this guy free? Is this? Because I couldn't get anybody from Marvel, so I was stealing from Wildstorm, just trying to find ways to, to bring a new energy to the line and different look. And because I love that. And then, I had the great fortune and a great friendship with Michael Turner. And that was a big deal for me to work with him and become friends with him, me too, along the way,
He was amazing. No, I hear you, man. And I know. I never interviewed him, but I certainly saw him at cons, and talking to his friends like Jeff Loeb and that, and Johns. It was a great loss. Absolutely, really, really great loss. And
and a real talent. Believe it or not a comic fan, but you could never tell in his art.
Jesus, yeah, man, holy shit, Jesus. And also, God, I forget the name of the company. Aspen. Thank you, man. Yeah, I mean, my God. Just that legacy that he left.
The wonderful crew of people. They wound up helping us and pulling stuff together and working with us. They became like a little bit of a farmed out studio for us in some ways, helping us out there. And Peter Steigerwald, who worked with Michael, is a massive talent. Just a massive talent in the business. Massive.
That's great. Boy, I'm glad you mentioned, because truly that was a new wrinkle that we always had letter pages, but social media, and also letter pages that were controlled by editorial. Yeah. So to see creators on social media voicing their gripes, like I said, Dwayne did it with Justice League, and I'm sure others did, as you're saying, and everything. So yeah, that's kind of a challenge editorially that I don't think any other era in comics ever had to deal with.
We're watching that happen, and it became a distraction, because it took the more meaningful conversation away and turned it into this, just amped the volume up into these quick little bites here, which just incensed people, which is problematic, and it just creates this level of frustration all around, and it's unnecessary. You're all working together, and I always push, you got to be respectful of each other. You got to be there, man. You got to at least understand the logic behind things, and you get later on, you get people that they don't even read the previous work, so they're taking over characters. They just want to do their version from what they read, and they have no idea of what happened since then. And I've always made it a point of making sure that I read as much back on everything as I can to at least be aware, so you don't repeat somebody's story, along the way. I mean, that's a little bit of a, you don't want to be telling the same story somebody else did, Yeah,
I hear you, man. But I also appreciate it, and really from the start, because even prior to New 52, you were playing with Helix and some of the other imprints that you came up with. I always say, I always give it up to Judd for Caper, which
I was just thinking, I almost wrote that to Judd online today. He was talking about Hilo, and I said, "Did you ever get the rights back to Caper?" I love that book. One of the things I always wanted to do. It goes back to the story. It goes back to the amount of Batman. Let's go to the amount of Batman product. I always said line of the books was only a third of Batman. I said you can only do as much as you had more of the potential and how much you needed more money as part of your budget, never to go more than a third of Batman. And the reason why I said that is that if you're on a three-legged stool and somebody kicks out the one leg, you're going to fall on your face. You know what I mean? If you can still balance on two legs, but if you only have two legs and one leg, you're going to fall on your face.
Sure.
So I always remind people that Batman, once Adam West show ends, Batman tanks. And when in the 80s before Dark Knight, he's a number 40 selling character, number 40. Okay? And DC gave up on Batman. They thought nobody would care about the character after Adam West. They thought it was so tainted at that point. Frank Miller reinvents Batman, and all of a sudden, then they get the Batman movie in '89, and all of a sudden we're off to the races. And great, haven't lost that momentum since, but it happened.
Sure.
And it could happen again,
Sure.
And so you can't put all your eggs in one basket. And I always, like I said, I always liked the other of DC. So when I first got there, Paul let me build what was called the Focus line, which was my first attempt. And it was the concept behind it was superpowers, not superheroes. People with powers that don't do superhero things. And we did 4 books. We were experimental in the coloring and the styles that probably work better today, but it was a chance to do something different. And I was a big fan of that.
Hard time,
I
Dan.
the Milestone stuff back. I believed in that material. I believed it deserved a return. But there was a lot of wounds between Milestone and DC that still hadn't healed. So that was one of the things.
Okay.
Then we got the Charlton characters. We got the Red Circle characters for a period of time. That's why I did New Age of Heroes, to bring in new characters with New Age of Heroes, constantly trying to refresh the line. I realized that instead of just reinterpreting old characters, we got to bring new guys in. We got to do something. But there's a lot of resistance to that. And New Age of Heroes worked at the start when the artists were on board, because the sell point was the artists. But as soon as those artists left, everything sort of tumbled a little bit, except for Terrifics. That one held up okay. And then my personal joy, and when you're coming to an end, when you're coming to an end, and there's certain things you want to do, and I melded my 2 worlds. I got my hands on the Hanna-Barbera characters.
Those were great.
The Looney Tunes characters.
They were great.
And we went to freaking town on that.
Yeah, you did. No, man, I'm Chaikin doing Rough and Ready, and some of those mashups like Black Lightning and Hong Kong Phooey. Come on,
crazy ass shit that made me that just telling the stories makes a smile on my face. And I have a whole shelf in my house of all the collections, all those push lines. The other one we didn't mention was First Wave. We tried to create that pulp feel.
Yes.
And the only reason, and what happened there was I was supposed to have the rights to the Shadow, and they got held up. And I had to go with the line without Shadow, and it was missing because Shadow and Batman was the centerpiece of that.
Sure.
And Azzarello had a good take on that. And when I lost that, it sort of lost a key piece. You know what I mean? And it's a shame because we had Spirit, we had Doc Savage, we had Golden Age Batman for intents and purposes, and it was going to be a blast. And it ran for a little while, but it should have been more too. But doesn't mean you ever stop trying. And I always sectioned off a piece of the line for that experimentation, And when I got there, we started create our own books within the DC universe. We did Bloodhound, we did Monolith. Simon Dark was another one we did.
Jolly's character, and I can't remember the name of it. Dan Jolly's character, and I can't remember.
That was Bloodhound. That was Bloodhound.
Oh, okay, Bloodhound. Yeah. And dude, Steve Gerber's last great with Brian Hurt. A Hard Time.
That's my labor of love. I always wanted to work with Steve Gerber. Steve Gerber, Steve Englehart, probably my favorite 2 writers of all time. But Steve Gerber in particular, I adore Steve Gerber stuff. And when I was working in animation, Beast Machines, I can tell the story now. I was working on Beast Machines. I was going to hire Steve Gerber to develop the new Transformers Beast Wars line that ultimately becomes Beast Machines. I go to hire Steve Gerber, and I went in with the Hasbro Cluster people. Cluster was the syndicator. And I said Steve Gerber's name, and I got screamed at. And it's clear that Steve did something on either Transformers or G.I. Joe that pissed people off so bad.
Crazy.
that literally 10 years later, they didn't even want to hear his name mentioned. So I missed out my opportunity. And I brought him in. And if you think about this. We did a series, Hard Time, which starts with a school shooting. I mean, try to do that series now.
Amen. Yeah, man.
It starts with a school shooting, and it's about a kid who developed powers in prison, but stays in prison because he feels guilty about what he participated in. He never pulled the trigger, but he was an active participant. And Steve's health was failing, and we kept that book going as long as he lived.
Wow.
And I wouldn't stop doing that book as long as he was alive. And once he passed, that was it. But I was happy to keep him working and have him working to the end, because you could tell it meant the world to him, and it was a book that he felt very personally attached to and such nature. So that was that. Every once in a while, I get to do a good thing like that, And Steve was there. There's a couple of guys we worked with that passed, and it's tough. It's tough.
I hear you, man. No,
when you grow up loving their stuff, Len's passing was a hard one for me, really hard one. That was a hard one.
Yeah, Keith a couple of years ago too. Yeah, Alex was very nice, one of our chat people, and he said, "Thanks, John, for having the best podcast interview with Keith." I lucked out. Our good friend Vanita Rogers. She's like, he never plans stuff. You're going to call him at home, and he's either going to want to talk or not. And I luckily got him to talk. Yeah. And after that, and I appreciated him being like kind of, and you'll have a better perspective of this, but Keith, obviously the whole comic fandom thing, it seemed like he would come to conventions because he had to, but I know, and he's like, John, we'd had one nice conversation. You got your best from me. I'm never going to do it again.
No,
I'm like, okay.
Yeah. I mean, the shame of it all is Keith, I'm in Florida, and Keith moved to Florida. And he was only about 30 minutes from my house. I used to go visit him.
Wow.
We try to get together once a month and just hang out and just talk, just chat. And he passed away on Sunday, I think. And that Wednesday beforehand, we had gone out to a bar, and they had a DC Comics trivia night. And Keith and I, our group participated, and we won. Thank God we won.
Good.
I have to admit, his son-in-law was a big help, because there was a lot of questions on the movies, and I don't know the movie shit at all.
Okay.
So he helped me on all that stuff, but we won, and I completely embarrassed Keith in the process, because I went in the back room and told everybody this was the guy that co-created Blue Beetle, and all the cooks. Who were a lot of Mexican cooks that were in place.
Oh, sure.
Mexican cooks come out, and they all line up, and they take this picture with Curmudgeon Keith standing in the middle, and it was a golden moment. And that's how I remember him.
Outstanding. That's great. Yeah. I had to ask him about when he was doing All-Star Comics in the 70s and working with Wally Wood, and of course Power Girls Breast Window and stuff. Yeah. And I'm like, all right, tell me about Woody, and not listening, and and he goes, oh my God, every time they would complain, Power Girl's breasts just got that much bigger.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, Dean Haspiel joining us. Hey, Dino.
Hey, Dean.
Hi, John and Dan. I know Dan is a huge Jack Kirby fan and got to write a bunch of classic Kirby characters. Is there a Kirby creation he would still love to tackle?
No, actually, the good news, Dean, is I got to do them all. Actually, with Keith for the most part. We did OMAC together. We did Forever People together. We did Manhunter together, and then we did Commandy together. That was my checklist. Demon I like, but not my character. So I had a chance to really work. One of the things I was really happy about that we did at DC was collect Spirit World and the Days of the Mob.
Yes,
which was a big one for me.
Sure,
because again, these are books of myth. I call them books of myth. You hear about them, but you can't afford them, you can't find them, and to be able to recollect those and reassemble them and was special to me, because I feel that's what Kirby, in Kirby's mind, I have a feeling that's what he came to DC to do in a weird way. Not just the same old thing.
Yes,
and while it didn't get a chance to live the way he wanted to do, we got a chance to make sure it stays in print. And I thought that was a big deal for us. Kirby's the guy that I followed into DC in a big way, and Commandy was one of my entry dogs next to Swamp Thing. House of Secrets, House of Mystery. Again, not Superman, Batman.
No, that's cool.
Although I have to admit, I had a weird fascination with Super Sons. I was a big Super Sons fan.
Bob Haney, everybody.
Yeah, I love Super Sons.
Me too, man.
And Paul didn't. Paul didn't like Super Sons.
Well, I could. Yeah, I mean, it was kind of goofy, but I hear what you're saying, man.
As a 10, 12-year-old, it pressed all the right buttons.
Dan, we're around the same age, man. Yeah. Absolutely, I felt the same way, man. And and also just. Bob Gibbon, I don't give a shit. Yeah, Wildcat and Batman for a while and Brave and Bold. Sure, why not? Hey, look, Earth 1 and Earth 2.
What I'm going to say is look at the rest of those World's Finest stories, and you're crazy calling this stuff.
That's true, too. Yeah, man. Yeah, you're absolutely right. No, and it is, I mean, really, when we were little kids, there were those weird things. I mean, it's funny. A friend sent me a couple Silver Age Superman covers, and I'm like, yeah, those are great. But it really did continue in the 70s where we just get these really weird ideas. I loved the 70s Superman at GBS with Steve Lombard and everybody, and just some of the crazy, Johnny Nevada.
I identified, like I said, I identified DC of the 60s with Neil Adams. I identified DC of the 70s with Garcia Lopez. 80s was Keith. 90s is Dan Jurgens, and then 2000s we switched to the writers, and I think that's where Jeff becomes the voice.
I hear you.
And one of the things I wanted to do, and one of the more interesting things, I got to talk about Dan Jurgens a second. I want to talk about.
Please do, man. I love Dan.
One of the most gracious, and smartest, nicest, wonderful people and talented people in comics. And when I got there, I'll admit it, I didn't want to work with him because he was so identified with the DC that was there before me, and I was there, to change it. Yeah, that I couldn't work with him, and he did the work at Marvel and all that. And then one day I'm at a convention in Chicago, and Dan comes to see me, and we go and we're talking. And in talking to him, I said that was one of the stupidest things I could do is keep somebody as creative as Dan away from this line. And I made myself a promise that he would always have work at DC at that point from now on, because we needed him in every step of the way. And he was a guy that took on any assignment, anything, and he was always there. And it's not just about revisiting Superman, but he just understood the characters and had a voice and a focus and a calmness that brought a cohesion to anything that he discussed, and just a good story at the end of the day. And and that's what I said. Guys like Keith and guys like Garcia Lopez and even Neil, everybody would always have a home at DC because of what they meant to the history of the company and the importance of the line. And and I'm happy to say that we work with these guys all the way through. Neil was working to the end with DC, which was a good thing.
Yep.
Garcia Lopez works whenever he wants to, and it always is open door. Even to this day, I think we still continue with it. And I feel the same way about Dan, and I felt the same way about Keith. They're treasures. They were treasures, and so important to so much that represented DC Comics. For half a century.
Yeah, Dan, and then his art and his writing, and I always, Dan is one of those guys. Chuck Dixon was like this too when he was at DC. You can give him any genre and any book, and he had something to say with it. And it's funny, a couple interviews ago, I really sat with my Marvel Unlimited app and really went back and read a lot of them, because I read Cap and a couple of things. I didn't read his Thor and a couple other things. And it's like, God damn, Dan,
his Thor is better than his Captain America, I think, quite honestly.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
His Thor completely knocked my socks off, because I was never a huge Thor fan, and his Thor was the first one that I kind of connected with in a way that I was actually surprised,
Yeah. No, and again, he was only, whether it was New 52 or the subsequent status quos that changed, Dan always found work and Dan had something to say. Yeah. Dan always had something to say. So, no, I love Dan. And really, he's one of those guys that I know he's not that much older than us, But I mean, I know in the '80s when I first saw him with Booster Gold and everything.
Yeah.
And now, I've had the pleasure of sharing a couple of limo rides with him. That I can, go from the airport.
My famous Dan Jurgens story is that when I was younger, in my 30s.
Okay. I remember those. Keep going.
Yeah, I kind of remember. I was at a convention. It was when they premiered Booster Gold, and I was the guy that stood up and gave him shit. I mean, stupid idea. I just went after it. I just said, Booster Gold's a dumb idea. Stealing the Legion ring. He's not a hero. Why are we even wasting time on this? Why are you even doing this? And he was so gracious up on stage. And honestly, that conversation I told you we had in Chicago, it starts with that. I start with that story, and Dan looks at me and goes, don't remember any of that. And I remembered, I thought to myself, you know what? That's my story, not yours. That's my moment with you, not your moment with me. And that became a governing factor for me with all the conventions that I would do, because that's why you have to be so respectful and listen to every fan, because it's their moment, not yours. They're there to see you, and you're not there to see them. You know what I mean? In a weird way.
I do.
So you have to be fully respectful of their moment, so they come out with a good feeling. And the best feedback I ever got on a convention, we did one of our insane panels that we weren't allowed to do later on. One of our crazy ass panels. Just
I love those.
Ranting, everything.
Yes.
The whole thing, pulling people on stage, the whole thing.
Yes.
The guy comes to me at the end of the panel and goes, this is the best convention panel I've gone to. I said, I didn't learn anything about any of the books, but I love the energy of DC, and I'm going to read them for the rest of my life. And I was like, you got it, buddy.
DC Nation, Dan, and those panels. And I was so bummed when they yanked down the podcasts of those that were available for a time. No, man, I'm sorry to hear. I assume those are people above you going, yeah, no more.
Oh, yeah, no, I got my hand slapped big time.
Well, Dan, I always felt bad because in our first conversation, you let out all these details about Batlash that was still months away. And then you told me, oh my God, Levitz was ready to kill me.
Oh, and yeah. What the funny, what it is that you're looking at books in production. So you kind of lose track of schedule sometimes. You look at solicitations, and honestly, I really did lose track of it. I'm talking about it like everybody knows what I'm talking about, and they're screaming at me, and that became a running gag on the panels. Is who's going to shut Dan up on the panel this time, and everybody took turns shutting me up.
No, honestly, Dan, and especially some of those Sundays when Marvel creators would come up too. And you guys would
Yeah, no, I had a rhythm to my panels. I had Friday was the crazy panel, just the insane, just ranting and raving. Saturday was the informational panel where the talents sort of pitched their stuff. And then Sunday was just comic book love, because I figure anybody's still around on Sunday, they're here because they love comics, not because they love one company over the other,
I hear you, man.
I just love telling those stories. There's that classic moment I used to tell people, what's the craziest point you ever bought a comic? And I used to hear about comic vending machines, people buying comics in the back of churches, all these crazy stories. And then one guy he tells me the story about how he put together a team of Humvees in Iraq to travel from one PX through a hot zone to another PX to get part 2 of a Batman story he was reading, because his PX didn't have it. And he basically put an entire platoon at risk to read a Batman story.
Wow.
And like he told that story, I slapped the desk and I said, I am never asking this question again, because nobody's ever going to beat that. And
that's amazing. Yeah, man. And I remember those initiatives in the Army to get, comics to the Army and stuff.
And for me, that moments, those conventions, that things with a lifeblood. No matter how beat up you felt, you go into a panel room and you see these people about loving the shit you're doing and appreciating it. It just fills you back up, and you take that energy and bring it back and feed it back out to everybody and hope that we get stuff going good again,
I do, Dan. And truly, the whole DC Nation initiative that you started there and stuff, I was always a DC fan first. I love my Marvel books, but as a little kid, DC was my first reading comics and everything. And no, you really came in with this energy and enthusiasm of, hey, we're doing really interesting, great stuff. Join us on the ride. And you had me at hello, as Renee Zellweger said.
Again, I tell the story about my very first convention I went to. I went to a panel. It was a big room. It was the final Oakland show for WonderCon. Okay. And we had 7 of our top talent on the dais. There's only about 50 people in the audience room that's held 500. And everybody asked questions about archives. And then one person asked the question, are you going to collect all the All-Star comics before I die? And I sat there going, holy fuck, everybody's going to die. And then there's nobody going to hear reading comics. I just changed businesses and everybody's going to be dead. All the audience is going to be dead. What am I going to do? And I'm like, and so that's when it came to me saying, we got to get younger. We got to get faster. We got to get smarter. We got to get more aggressive. We got to be, and we sort of slammed the foot on the gas. And honestly, I don't think I ever took it off as much as everybody kept on grabbing my leg, trying to get it off the pedal. But I just said, you can't let up. And as I said, it's okay to fail. And that's the best part about it. You say, in our profession, when we fail, nobody dies. There's a lot of jobs where people die if you don't do your job correctly.
Sure.
Nobody dies. We could put out a bad book and we could put out a good one next week. We always get them. And that was the great part about TV I loved, about soap operas and animation. If that one doesn't work, we can get them again. I don't spend 5 years making a movie. When the movie comes out, I want to shoot myself because it didn't come out right. So you're always, if you get over it, you learn from your mistakes, you keep moving forward and hopefully not repeat them. Even if you do, it's okay. You just got to keep on trying. And that's the best part about it.
Well, and Dan, truly, since walking away from DC, I love the fact that you're still in comics. And
I don't feel like I'm in comics. I mean, it's funny because we talked about this. We talked about the Diamond stuff, and and naturally, I have a vested interest in certain things happening because I had a book through Diamond. But I'm watching it unfold, and I think we're at a watershed moment. I really do. I think we're at a watershed moment, and it depends on how we seize it. And it depends on what we want to be when we grow up. We still have to grow up as an industry. We're still hobbyists. We're still collectors first. We're still fans first. And things like this basically force you have to re-examine it, and you have to re-examine everything. And I don't know if there's a collective or a group or anything that's really examining what works and what's not working in the business anymore, and approach it as a business, not as a business that has, we have to do this, but as a business saying what's working, what's not working, what's other opportunities, where are other successes, what can we emulate? That's how we used to run at DC. And Diamonds had a little bit of that, but they sort of took a step back. They never were in charge, And when I look at these other distributors coming up, my first thought has always been, why are the publishers exclusive to a distributor? That's my first question. In the older days, when the industry first really took on the direct market, it's the retailer that was exclusive to a distributor, but there were multiple distributors they could choose from. So they were exclusive with the one that made the most sense for their store.
Sure.
And I used to see distributors that if they didn't have a store in a region, they would help finance and create other stores to distribute in that area to get a portion of that business. So that's the way the business grew. So then when you collapsed all the retailers, all the distributors to one, the urgency to have multiple stores sort of went away with it, and that's one of the issues. But to put all your eggs in one basket, and we don't have that appreciable amount of product anymore being sold, primarily because we're not selling dollar books anymore. We're selling $5 books, and sooner or later that's going to impact you. So you might see the same number on your bottom line, but you're selling to less people. So therefore, every time you lose incremental people, you have a greater impact on your budget because one person has more value than 10,000 they might have had beforehand. And I always had a fear of putting out. I used to joke saying we're going to put out $100 books that sell to 1,000 people, and guess what? That's what's on Kickstarter right now.
Right.
And that's a Kickstarter. And as soon as the bigger companies start to look at that model, they're chasing a really bad path, so they have to really rethink what's going on and whether returnability gets reintroduced and things like this, but they all are interconnected. You can't just change pieces here and there and then expect the whole thing to work. It doesn't work that way. That's how New 52 started to come apart, because we just changed pieces without examining what we did as a whole to make it work at the start. And you have to look at the reasoning behind what the direct market was about, the reasoning what direct market is today, and ultimately try to re-examine what's the best way to move forward. And on top of that, other venues. There's nothing against the stores, but sooner or later you're going to have to start looking at other venues. Because if you go back to the early days of direct market, there was the other books. I keep on talking about my other books. The other books were successful. G.I. Combat, House of Mystery were successful comics on the newsstand. But when we moved into the direct market, the resources to make those books shifted to superheroes because that's what the hobbyists that were creating stores wanted to see. So ultimately you got out of the other business that grabbed the casual audience and you shifted into a much more focused audience approach. Now, non-returnability made that smaller audience profitable, but if that audience gets smaller, they become less profitable. And more importantly, try to grow from it, you've sort of chased away everybody else. And I talk about how comics lost generations to anime and other places. And I believe we might have lost 2 and possibly 3 generations to the point now, how do we make this come back? So it's a fascinating thing to watch, but it's not a bunch of guys just jumping on the lunar ship or jumping on the manual ship. And it's the short-term fix, but not an answer, because at the end of the day, Random House is now a publisher too, as Boom.
Right. Correct.
So it's a direct competitor to the people they're distributing. And on the retailer side, Lunar is a retailer. So
a store and a distributor.
Retailers.
Yes.
That's something that Diamond didn't offer. You know what I mean? And we went very hard in the paint on those guys to make sure they didn't cross those lines. And we were able to focus them to make sure they were distributor only. But these other ones, when you're dealing with these fractions of the business, these other businesses help support them, but it puts you to direct conflict with what your primary goal is with the other people you're dealing with. So, it's going to be interesting to see.
I hear you, man. No interest in being an independent voice that could maybe gather some of these publishers.
We had a point that we were trying to do it. It's the problem on the publisher side is that it's collusion. That's the problem. On the distributor side, the energy isn't there yet. We try to have Diamond be the focus. That's why Diamond comes up with things like Free Comic Day and things like that. They did these things that were attempted to be things. And I mean, Free Comic Day was never about the free comics. It was about the concept, bringing people into a store, which worked very well for the stores for so long. And then, it became a sale day, to the point that they try to emulate it outside of just one day a year.
Sure.
It was one of the best selling days for a retailer, if not the best selling day. So that can't go away. It has to exist some shape or form, regardless of who implements it, down the road,
That's a great subject that I got to bring up to Christina Merkler from Lunar, because she's been a longtime friend back when they were doing in-stock trades and discount comic book service, and even an early sponsor of Word Balloon. So no, you're right, Dan, and truly, I've had a couple conversations about the Diamond collapse. In fact, here Dean even says the Diamond age is becoming the Kickstarter age for the creators. Absolutely,
the creators,
I don't know.
Yeah, and honestly, that's the fear is the bigger companies starting to get into that space, and look, if a collapse of Diamond or this collapse comes in where smaller publishers are not invited into the distributors because of the scope of what they do, then Kickstarter becomes the most viable option for them. Absolutely. But if somebody comes in and starts chewing up that money or chewing up the interest, the hard part for all this, for everybody right now, is in the older days, I hate to use that expression, but I'm going to, audiences found your books. They were looking, they found our books. Now we flip the paradigm. The creators are looking for the audience. You know what I mean? And it's a necessity to go out there and to constantly be out there promoting and selling and pushing, and what platform and this platform, and those, constantly going out there to get people going in order to keep your name in the spotlight, so that way when you do push a product out, you have an appreciable audience you're selling to, and you can get a fraction of that purchasing your material. And the other days you would, somebody was asking me the other day about how did we sell our books, when I first got to DC. I said, well, we didn't have a huge sales and marketing department like we did. What we did is I rebuilt the relationship with DC and Wizard. DC and Wizard didn't have a magazine, but Wizard at that point was a focal point for the industry. Everybody went to Wizard. Everybody read Wizard, and that drove sales. And I was able to show actual sales improvements because of Wizard support. Hawkman was the Hawkman book we did. It spun out of JSA. We did a preview in Wizard magazine, and that book broke almost 70,000 copies. And everybody knew that Hawkman didn't sell 70,000, so they attributed a lot of that success to the Wizard premiere. And then Then we do Hush in there, and then whoop, everything blows up.
Wow. Yeah, Dan, absolutely. No, that period of when you'd get half issues and things at Wizard,
Yeah,
as those specials and everything. No, I hear what you're
talent, the top 10 people need.
Yes,
it was able to direct people to where to look for books. And right now, without that aggregate or something that drives that audience, or something that pushes that information out, we're all out there screaming in the wind right now. Look at my book, look at my book, look at my book. And there's right now, where it used to be 100 voices, there's thousands of voices, and it's all fighting for the same small piece of the pie. And that's the hardest thing about it. And everybody keeps us shouting to the same people, and we haven't found a way to shout out to a crowd that might be interested in the things we're creating, but not aware of them right now. I mean, even at DC, when they did the DC Online, they were dedicated to the comics, but they desperately needed the movies and TV information and support to drive the needle. So we ultimately became, even though we were quote unquote the lead concept, we were the caboose. 16 cars back, if you want to be.
I'm hip. Yeah, absolutely, Dan. No. Geez, Dan, unbelievable conversation as always. I truly, I really appreciate us getting into the nuts and bolts as much as the stories.
Oh yeah. It's fun for me now because I've been removed from it now for 5 years. So
yeah,
it's kind of interesting to to sit back a little bit, and it's hard for me too because first of all, I don't remember detail wise. I might forget a couple of things along the way. Second thing is, I keep an eye on things. The good news, the bad news is I haven't been around for 5 years, but also at the same time, I've been involved enough that I know what's going on. That was the joy of working on Frank Miller Presents. What I really wanted to do was roll up my sleeves and do everything else. It was easy to come in top down and tell people what to do, but actually do it. I never forgot. I think I wrote a note to Adam Phillips saying about how much I appreciate the effort he put into the previous catalog. I never realized how much work that was.
Wow, cool.
You know what I mean? I was doing it, and I was doing it for two or three books or 4 books, and he was doing it for 80
for the line. For the whole line, absolutely.
You know what I mean? It's you don't realize, and I found that newfound appreciation of just the nuts and bolts work to get things done and get it out there. Was a trip. It was good. It was a good exercise. It was tough, and a newfound appreciation for a lot of work that a lot of people did over the years. Not that I didn't appreciate what they did, but there's a deeper level to understanding about how much work is being put into these things on a daily basis. And more importantly, how necessary it is. On top of that, so it's interesting.
Dan, you're inspiring good ideas for guests on Word Balloon. I had Adam on a couple months ago, or maybe last year. And it would be great to hear his perspective on all the diamond stuff. I think he would be great. And Christina is well, the ballooner.
Yeah. It's fascinating to me to watch from the outside. I mean, it's interesting. When I was there, we did have a diamond contingency plan in case something bad happened with diamond. My plan was regional because I was still I took the model that was built in the 80s. Because if you look at the 80s, they're in the black and white boom. There was a lot of small distributors.
Yes. Yes,
a lot of small distributors, and a lot of the black and white companies thrived and survived off of small distributors.
Yes,
so it was a lot more regional. They didn't have, so the freight wasn't as bad because you're going, it's not going distance and sending it out across the country. More of it was more, I would almost say bicycled locally in a weird way. You know. So, you drive the car, they drive and drop, at the stores.
Right. No, it's like an hour away or 2 hours away as opposed to cross country and everything. I get it.
It wasn't as well shipping. It wasn't much, delivery.
Yeah.
So, I was looking at that, looking at key retailers that could support, supporting the other retailers in the area, just to keep it going. If there was a problem, then figure out a bigger picture down the road. So it was interesting to see ultimately what happened during COVID and how a portion of that wound up becoming something else.
Were there other headaches about COVID that were oh shit moments during that pencils down period?
Oh, listen, I wasn't. Like I said, I was out. The irony for me is, I was out of DC 3 weeks before COVID hit, or 2 weeks before COVID hit.
Oh, there you go. All right, so it wasn't your problem.
Literally, it was, as I said, I was on a fast-moving train, and I stepped off, and the train was about to leave me on the platform, and it took off, and then it stopped still in the entrance because the whole world stopped.
Yeah.
And the weird part for me is, like, I was able to stop vibrating, internal vibration. I was able to slow down, and it's in about 6. And then I shut down for about 6 months. I couldn't, just was done. And as I like to say, if I was probably at DC at that point, I probably would have been arrested for going to people's houses, find out what they're doing, and talking to them in person.
Well,
I actually did a panel at MegaCon during the height of COVID, where everybody's in masks. They pulled all the chairs out of the panel room, out of the room, and everybody had to stand 6 feet apart. And I'm on stage, and I'm like, what the fuck is this?
Yeah,
man. I'm on stage, but I didn't have to wear a mask because I was far enough away. And I'm like, yeah, I spit when I talk. I don't know.
Well, you're an enthusiastic man, Dan. I totally appreciate that. That's all right. No, Dan, terrific talk, man. Seriously, I'm going to bug you probably again this year and I don't want to bug you too much. It means a lot you come back. It always meant a lot to me. And I knew I made a connection when Jan Jones and Fletcher are like, hey, you're the guy that imitates Dan DiDio.
Yeah.
And seriously, Dan, you've always been a good sport about that. And I truly, it means a lot, man. Because honestly, it was never done with malice. It was always done with respect.
Was it imitation, the sincerest form of flattery? Is that what it is? Something like that?
Yeah, something like that.
It's been good. I mean, right now, like I said, it's keeping me busy. I had my novel. I had a 2-book deal. I'm working on the 2nd book, and that's what going on around me here right now. So
okay, yeah, you said you got your whiteboards.
I'm completely absorbed in it right now. I'm lost.
Yeah, you're Rip Hunter. You got your whiteboards all over the place. So
I love my whiteboards. Like everybody knows, I love my whiteboards. It's funny. I did the first book and it did okay, but it sort of caught the tail end of the superhero fatigue a little bit in storytelling, and I got a chance to get into horror a little bit, which is but Keith and I used to talk about all the time. I used to love talking about horror with him. We had a great time talking that stuff. And so this is my book for him in a weird way. It's my horror book for him.
So it won't be a continuation. It'll be a new thing.
What's that?
It won't be a continuation.
No. I'll only continue things if it was a demand for it or interest in it, or we found alternate life for it in other media. But realistically, the joy of both. I hate using the word, but the joy of being retired. For the most part, in some way, is you get to pick and choose what you want to do and do whatever you like, And I'm very fortunate that I'm in that position. My priority is to family right now. I've got 5 grandkids. I go see them on a regular basis. Once I'm, up to New Jersey, 20-degree weather to go see them for their birthdays. Yeah. And there's no better feeling in the world. That's my priority, and the other stuff is just so I don't drive everybody crazy. I keep myself busy and there's certain things that you make commitments to yourself in a younger form, in a younger life, that you kind of just want to see through. And these are the things that I'm doing now,
Attaboy. No, that's fantastic. Everybody, Defenders of the Earth, great callback to the King Feature Heroes as a team. Issue 4 is out, and the collection comes out in February. And then, boom, issue 5 for the 2nd arc starts in March. So absolutely, check it out from Mad Cave.
Thanks so much.
Great stuff from Jim California. Yeah, Jim California and Dan DiDio. And no, Dan, I thank you very much, and I appreciate it. And that's good. I love talking to you, and it means a lot. And like I said, I'll be bugging you probably later on, and maybe after the 2nd arc or whatever. But
that sounds great. Thanks
good luck with everything.
It was a pleasure. Great seeing you. I'm glad you're doing well, and I'm glad you're still doing the Blue Word Blue. Congratulations with it all, man.
Thanks, man. Yeah, 20 years, Dan.
Jeez Louise. You lose perspective, and you think about all the other guys. In all honesty, John, you think about all the other guys who have come and gone in that period of time. You know what I'm saying?
I hear you. Yeah, I do.
And the level of consistency and just enjoyment of talking to it. And I think these are the things that are essential to keep the conversation alive and become this record of a business, that we love,
That's my intent, Dan. Growing up on Amazing Heroes and Comics Journal and David Anthony Kraft's.
I've got two long boxes of Comics Journal and Amazing Heroes in my house. So
come on, man! Absolutely.
I got rid of the Wizards, most of them, mostly because they're really heavy.
I understand.
I'm still doing long boxes, and I can't carry that shit anymore. But I still got my Amazing Heroes, and I still got my. I even got the comic readers. Remember the comic reader? Shit.
Sure. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Too goddamn funny. No, Dan, seriously, thanks for playing. Thanks everybody for watching. Great stuff next week on Word Balloon Live. I know Alex Segura is going to be along, and got him right now. I'm blanking on who else.
Until Alex said hi, man. He's killing it right now. I'm glad to see
him
doing so well.
And then I know, isn't that fantastic, man? No, he's absolutely
Really
he's
awesome.
just a
Really
mystery
awesome.
writer. God
Excellent.
bless him, man. Sure. So everybody, until next time, everybody stay safe, stay happy, stay healthy.